Hovering above the bleached shoulder of the motorway, a kestrel appears like a portent perched in air. This image from Iris Murdoch's A Year of Birds recalls a well-known passage in her philosophical work, The Sovereignty of Good, in which a traveller, looking upon a kestrel, is able to leave the brooding self behind. There is nothing now but kestrel. So is the kestrel of the poem a portent of something further down the road for the traveller, or does it signify nothing but itself, a kestrel portending kestrels all the way down? Sita Turner, reflecting on Murdoch's early poems from the 1950s, has written, "Her attention to the ordinariness of nature can be seen in numerous metaphors and images of birds, spiders, and stars. Her poetry is an attempt to unself." Unselfing was the word Murdoch used to describe the effort to transcend the confines of subjectivity and achieve a kind of ecstasis by focusing attention on the world outside your head. The 12 short poems in A Year of Birds demonstrate this effort to reproduce the thing observed unstained by the observer, escaping what Murdoch called the fat, relentless ego. Hello and welcome to Read This, Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast. I'm Ash, your host, and today I'll be talking about A Year of Birds, a short book of poems by Iris Murdoch. First published in 1984, the collection featured woodcut illustrations by Murdoch's friend, Reynold Stone, who had died 5 years earlier. The book is comprised of a sequence of 12 poems, named after the months of the year, and each revolving around a different species of bird. Today we will look at some of the folklore associated with Murdoch's chosen birds, the motif of mimicry echoing throughout the sequence, and consider the place of poetry in Murdoch's life and better-known works of fiction and philosophy. Joining me to talk about A Year of Birds and making his return to the podcast is Miles Leeson, Director of the Iris Murdoch Research Centre at the University of Chichester and lead editor of the Iris Murdoch Review. Miles is also one of the editors on the upcoming edition of selected poems of Iris Murdoch, which is due to be published by Chatto and Windus in November of this year, under the title Poems from an Attic. We'll hear a little bit more about the process of putting that collection together, but to start things off, I asked Miles to give us an introduction to Murdoch the poet.
Yeah, so she publishes poetry through. So she writes poetry throughout her life. There are times when there are gaps of maybe 5 or 6 years, but she always goes back to it, and it depends. So there's a lot of poetry early in her life, some in the 60s and 70s. But then later in her life, she comes back to it in quite a big way, which is interesting, I think. And there are. When you know her novels really well, and then you look at the poetry, you can think, there's an idea in that poem that finds itself and finds its better expression in one of her novels. So it's kind of like with Murdoch's work, it's kind of like joining up a spider's web. You can see, different particular ideas, and she comes back to particular themes and topics time and time again. Lost love, death. I mean, obviously the kind of classic kind of poetry that you would ideas that you would expect. But I mean, animals and birds particularly, going through the unpublished poetry, there's so many there.
What kind of response did A Year of Birds get, or what sort of critical standing does it have amongst Murdoch scholars?
Two different things really. In a sense, A Year of Birds, I think, passed everybody by. It was brought out in a very limited edition, very limited run by Chatto and Windus. Although it sold quite well, and I think that's why it was reprinted about 8-9 years later by them. But again, it's still in very limited numbers, and if you go looking for it, it's quite difficult to find and also quite expensive to purchase now, which is a shame, I think. There was talk a couple of years ago about whether it ought to be reissued again, but that hasn't happened yet. As far as Murdoch scholars go, it's not really talked about a great deal, and I think that's because obviously we have so many novels, 26 of them, a lot of philosophy, including an unpublished work that's just about to be published in the next year or two on a whole monograph on Martin Heidegger, which will again, I think, give fresh impetus to that. Her last work, Metaphysics: A Guide to Morals, hasn't really had a huge amount of attention, although in the last 5-10 years it's been gathering pace there. And then you've got the plays, which people haven't really talked about too much, and the poetry, I suppose, is maybe a fourth or fifth string to what she was known for. So really very little attention. I've been in the field about 20 years, and I can only remember one kind of paper at a conference on it, so very little known. I think what will happen is, because Murdoch left so many unpublished poems in her notebooks that were thankfully donated to the archive at the University of Kingston in 2016, that hopefully will be published in the near future. I can talk a little bit more about that, and if you want me to, in a minute. I think once those are out in the public domain, although if anybody listening is interested, you can book into Kingston and go and read them, or you just can't quote from them extensively at the moment, because they're obviously under copyright. I think once those are out in a year or two's time, I think there will be a surge of interest, and I think firstly people will start to look for the connections between the poems and her other published work. Whether then she'll then be seen as an important poet in her own right, I don't know. I think that's really for other people who are perhaps a little bit more objective than I am, shall we say, and who know poetry much better than I do, to make that kind of decision. Of course, it will be, I'm sure when the press get hold of it, this selected edition of Murdoch's poems will be reviewed, and we'll see what people make of them.
Commenting on the acoustics of Murdoch's fiction, Gillian Dooley has written, Murdoch orchestrates her sound worlds as much with ambient noise, birdsong, and human sounds overheard as with actual music. In A Year of Birds, Murdoch includes notations of bird calls like the I of seagulls or the chat and caw of rooks. But more often, the noises of her birds exhibit a human inflection, singing in happiness or complaining like the collared doves in March. The first poem, January, claims that inland seagulls never cry, suggesting an emotional basis for their behaviour, uncharacteristically muted because they are far from home. According to folklore, seagulls are the embodied spirits of drowned sailors, and the ones we find in Murdoch's poem, described in a very un-seagull-like way as humble and silent, also seem to have acquired some humanity along their journey inland. Murdoch's arrangement of the poems, pairing birds with times of the year, recalls other folklore traditions. The poem for May, for example, centres on the cuckoo, the ambassador of spring, whose appearance was so strongly connected with the seasonal activities of humans that Edward A. Armstrong has written, locally in the English counties, the cuckoo is commonly said to arrive on the date of a fair. According to a rhyme originating in Norfolk, the cuckoo can be thought of as almost a feathered calendar. In April, come he will. In May, he sing all day. In June, he changes tune. In July, he prepares to fly. And in August, go he must. The cuckoo's close association with human habits have led to a tradition of asking a cuckoo how long you have to live, or how long you have to wait until you get married. The number of calls you hear from the cuckoo gives you your answer. We also seem to have rubbed off on the cuckoo a complex and ambivalent morality, as felt in this Scots verse. The cuckoo's a fine bird, he sings as he flies. He brings us good tidings, he tells us no lies. He sucks little birds' eggs to make his voice clear, and when he sings cuckoo, the summer is near. The nymphs of the insects known as froghoppers, or spittlebugs, coat themselves in a foam made from plant sap. And as the name implies, this foam looks like a gobbet of frothy saliva, which in some places is known as cuckoo spit. Supposedly, the cuckoo would produce this spit either by slavering in lust or in the heat of lovemaking, a token example of the cuckoo's long-standing association with promiscuity and adultery. This is undeserved slander of the cuckoo, in the view of Edward A. Armstrong, for which, he says, the Tudor playwrights must bear most of the opprobrium. In her poem May, Murdoch uses echoes of wedding celebrations, ripening flowers, and hollow cries to intimate the seediness of the cuckoo. Now in the park, white cricketers and cuckoo calls. How like confetti the wild cherry falls. Cool buds of May still keep the rose concealed, hollow as a flute that cry across the field.
I guess if you have a think about the kind of the ecological framework of some of her novels, then you can see, I think, the way in which she's dealing with landscape and the way she's dealing with birds being an important element to that. those particular landscapes is really important. So I think the one that I'm interested in to begin, I guess, probably would be, let's say July, for example. This is about the blackbird. Blackbird digging in the warm mown grass, glancing about with an eye of glass. Blackbird digging in the mown grass heap. How mechanical you look, flirting and glistening in agitation. Quiet now, yellow beak, motionless, listening for tiny little things, their doomed crepitation. And crepitation is not a word that you often find in poetry, and nor do you find it an awful lot in fiction. But I think that's a very much a Murdochian word to use, and you would expect to find her connection of small animate objects creeping and being kind of picked up upon by characters in her novels quite a lot. And sometimes these can be moments for real transcendence, if you like, and the sort of the moving out. Particularly, I'm thinking about here for your readers the vision of the mouse in I think it's Accidental Man, when one of the characters sees a mouse in the underground running along the line, and he's kind of bored out of himself. There's another poem a little bit later on which probably has much more resonance with people who know Murdoch's philosophy. This is August, the next one. Spot the bird, and you'll probably, if you know Murdoch, you'll probably know it. By the bleached shoulder of the motorway, the August traveller released to holiday. See suddenly a potent perched in air, in meditation aloof near the lethal tarmac, the moveless flutter of the fragile kestrel. For those people out there listening who know Murdoch's philosophy well, her image of the kestrel comes in very strongly in essay collection Sovereignty of Goods, the classic Murdoch kind of images of the hovering kestrel. That says somebody in a train going to who knows where, and they are kind of consumed they're sitting in this train, they're consumed with their own kind of worries and fears, I suppose, of life, and they're kind of caught up in their own personal psychodrama. And all of a sudden they look out the window and they see this kestrel which is outside of them, outside of the train, and it's has got no connection to them at all, and it's just living in the outside world. It's just doing its own thing. It doesn't have any connection to them or to, in a sense, humanity rolling past. And the character the character idea that Murdoch uses in that essay is that all of a sudden this person perceives this kestrel as something other than themselves, and in that moment they're changed and they give their attention not to themselves and their own inner drama, but outside to the kestrel, and it brings them out of themselves. It's again one of these moments of transcendence that we see. And the kestrel appears in the fiction as well in her, I think, very underrated novel Henry and Cato from the 1970s, I think 76. That's another interesting moment where characters again perceive this kestrel outside of themselves. One has a positive reaction, one has a negative reaction to it, and it's all about, I guess, the way in which we as readers, but also characters, are taken out of themselves and made to consider, not just other people, but also nature. So nature and ecology, so important to Murdoch's thinking and kind of development as a philosopher as well.
The poems in A Year of Birds are unshowy and meditative. Ranging from 4 to 10 lines long, they read less like a collection of 12 poems than a single poem of 12 stanzas. Murdoch's verse can at times be quite unwieldy. For example, she ends her first poem on the braggadocious call of the gulls, "I, I," but it produces a contorted awkwardness to finish on. Winter white they pass me by, as pale as paper in the sky, silent birds who never cry, arrogantly I, I. At times the poems read as if the effort at unselfing has succeeded too well, creating a kind of alien manner, either through the utmost simplicity, beside the red tree the swan spreads a long wing, or rather eccentric word ordering, shaggy their old nests in the blotched tree are. But one of my favourite poems of the collection is the poem For March, featuring collared doves. In dreadful light March evenings, where the violets stain, and primrose pales the wood and trees are bare, and other happy birds do sing, our husky pairs of collared doves complain, never at ease. O pretty lovers, does the spring now in your thoughtless blood so soon declare that love is pain? The end rhymes of stain, complain, pain, sing and spring and bear and declare are intruded upon by that abrupt odd line out, never at ease. The line offers a small recognition that despite what we might like to imagine about pairs of doves, nature will not brook the cosy symmetries and narratives we impress upon it. The thoughtless blood pays them no heed. Another one I like is the poem for November, featuring an owl on the hunt, who shrieks to make his victim stir, soft wings beat up, sad tail hangs down, in feathers sleeps the fir. That final line has that offbeat quality, slightly fiddly to say, in feathers sleeps the fir, but evocative. Does it literally mean a caught, dead rodent sleeping forevermore within the feathers of its predator? Or is it the idea or the image of the rodent urging the owl on its hunt to shriek and flush them out of hiding? Or should we read the line the other way around, as in the sleeping fur of a mammal dreaming up the image around it of an owl?
What, was she an ornithologist, Murdoch, or a bird watcher? Were birds? Was she interested in them as a hobby, or was this sort of?
That's an interesting question. I think she was just interested in being out in nature as much as possible.
Right.
So wherever she went in the world, and she and John Bailey did an enormous amount of traveling in Asia, the Far East, all around Europe, and the US as well. She didn't get to South America, but wherever she would go, she would, as writers of course always do, take a notebook, and she would, put her thoughts and ideas into her journals. Again, we have 10, 11 journals of her from her entire life, from her teenage years right the way through to when she became afflicted with Alzheimer's, that are still unpublished and in the archive, which are available to see in there. Maybe at some point, but bits of those will be published. But again, you can see when she's on her travels, she's always writing about the locations that she's in, and more often than not the urban, but the rural environments that she's experiencing. And she would write poetry in these environments as well. There's a really good poem about her husband seeing a stork at Zamora in Spain, which is probably the one amongst Murdochians that's best known. But it's about him seeing a stork. Would you like me to read it?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
That's an exclusive.
It is.
Yeah.
So this has been published before. This is in the Paul Huller and Jose Maroya collection, which came out in 1997. This is called John Sees a Stork at Zamora. Walking among quiet people out from mass, he saw a sudden stork fly from its nest upon a house. So blue the sky, the bird so white. For all these people an accustomed sight. He took his hat off in sheer surprise and stood and threw his arms out wide, letting the people pass him by on either side, aware of nothing but the stork arise. On a black tapestry now, this gesture of joy, so absolutely you. And a lot of these poems are very personal. A lot of them are dedicated to friends, former lovers. And I think once they come out and are published, which they will be, I think it will give a whole new dimension to how we perceive Murdoch's life and work. Obviously, when the film, the Oscar-winning film, came out in 2001, when Peter Conradi's biography was published at that point in time, that gave a whole different angle on Murdoch's life. And I think the poems will add to that richness of how we perceive her as a writer and as somebody who was deeply invested not just in fiction, but in all aspects of creative writing.
So for those listening along who haven't seen any video of me flashing this cover up, it also features wood engravings by Reynolds Stone.
Indeed, yeah.
What can you tell us about him and Iris Murdoch's relationship? Because I gather they were friends.
They were very good friends. They met at a party in the early 60s. I should say that it was really a foursome made up of Reynolds Stone, incredibly well known in his lifetime as an engraver. Everybody listening, if you're listening in the UK, you almost certainly have a piece of Reynolds Stone artwork in your house. If you go in your drawer and if you've got a passport, look at the front cover of the passport. That was designed by Reynolds Stone.
Wow.
If you're a reader of the Times, have a look at the Times masthead. That was designed by Reynolds Stone. But yeah, his own his own font, his own engravings. I mean, his engravings could be found in Westminster Abbey, and so many other places besides. There was a wonderful biography of him that came out that was written by his son Humphrey Stone just a few years ago, which I warmly recommend to people. And so he was very well known in his life. Indeed, at his memorial in London when he died, Iris Murdoch gave the address, which shows, I think, how close they were. His wife, Janet Stone, who outlived him, but is sadly now deceased, was a very well-known photographer as well. And together, in their house, the old rectory, which is in Lytton Cheney in Dorset, which is still there, it's a beautiful building. They hosted kind of weekend soirees, well, almost more than soirees, I should think. It's almost like an artistic commune. And they would invite not just the Murdochs, but they had Siegfried Sassoon down there, Sylvia Townsend Warner, Cecil Day-Lewis and his son Daniel Day-Lewis, all sorts of artists, creative people, actors, and so yeah, Murdoch and John would go down. Iris and John would go down there, and Reynolds would paint in the garden. And Iris would write, and John would read or write, and Janet would take photos of them. Those photos are there are hundreds of photos. Reynolds and Janet's son-in-law Ian Beck brought out a wonderful book 4 or 5 years ago now called Through the Lens of Janet Stone, which is still available online, which contains photographs of all of these people that were at the house in Lytton Cheney, the old rectory. In a sense, it became to that kind of that 1960s, 1970s group of artists and creatives, much as Charleston was, I think, to the Bloomsbury group. And indeed, Leonard Woolf used to go to Lytton Cheney. So there's an interesting connection there, I think, from Bloomsbury through to the Murdoch's period. So yeah, really close friends. Reynolds Stone also designed the dust jacket for Murdoch's novel The Italian Girl, which came out in the mid-60s. And indeed, in The Italian Girl, the main character, Otto, is a stone engraver, but his character and his personality owe nothing to Reynolds Stone whatsoever. Otto is an awful person. So I think he realised that it wasn't based on him at all. But I think the landscape and owes a little bit to Lytton Cheney as well, which was set in its own grounds and had its own lake, and it is a very beautiful location. So they're close friends, and they collaborated on A Year of Birds. Originally, it was going to be a calendar with an engraving and one of Murdoch's poetry, but next to each of the 12. But then it got in the discussion process, it got turned into this little book by Chatto and Windus, who were very keen to publish it, because of course Murdoch at this point in time in the 80s into the night was at this point in the 80s was really at her zenith. She was sort of she sold an awful lot of books, and she did very well for them. Obviously, she'd won the Booker at this point, so it was a surefire bet really that if they brought out a small volume of Murdoch's poems, it would sell very well.
Yeah. Did she often collaborate?
Yes and no. The no is that she would never be edited. After her first novel, she always refused at all to be edited, and indeed, and she published when she was writing The Good Apprentice in 1984 and then submitted it for publication. Her editors, I think she had a new editor who tried to take an awful lot out of it, and she just wrote back a terse note saying, "Put everything back in that you took out," and that was it. And Iris could not be edited. So in a sense, she didn't collaborate in that way, but yes, she did. I think she always said that she didn't draw from life, but clearly she drew quite a lot from life, for particularly her enchanter figures like Misha Fox in Flight of the Enchanter, Julius King in Fairly Honourable Defeat, Bradley Pearson in The Black Prince. All of them owe something to her former lover and indeed Nobel Prize winner, the author Elias Canetti. One of the characters in Nice the Good owes something to her friend Philippa Foot, and so on. And like I said, Reynolds Stone's house is perhaps in The Italian Girl a little bit. So in a sense, there's that kind of artistic collaboration there. And of course, with her husband, although he didn't look at her drafts, I think that kind of intellectual, him being in one room writing his literary criticism and her being in another room writing her fiction, there's something that I'm thinking about at the moment is that kind of collaboration within that unspoken collaboration of an evening. What are you doing? What are you writing about? And you can see that in his love of the Russian authors, and how that kind of influence of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy find their way into her novels as well, particularly into the 1980s. And there's also the suggestion that John had quite a strong hand in the writing and editing of the first chapter of The Bell in 1958. Of course, they'd only been married a couple of years at that point. But I asked John about this, actually. I wrote to him, although I did get to meet him after that. And the letter which I have downstairs back from him, I said, what kind of role did you have? And he said, oh, my dear boy, it was so long ago, I can't really remember. But he didn't say he didn't have any. So I'm taking that he probably had a small hand.
Right, yeah.
Writing of The Bell. So collaborations on the fiction, not so much. But of course, musical collaborations as well, including A Year of Birds being turned into a musical piece that was performed at the proms.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was that process like? By who? Who turned it into music?
So that was by Malcolm Williamson, an Australian composer, and this was his final piece, actually. So he was an Australian composer. He was trained at the Sydney Conservatorium, but he made his career in the UK. In 1975, his first appointment was as the Master of the Queen's Music. He was the first non-Briton to ever hold the post. And he was a prolific composer in many forms. He wrote 10 operas, 6 ballets, mini operas with audience participation, choral works, song cycles, chamber music. And he and Murdoch got on very well. They became friends. And he adapted. Well, adapted is the wrong word, but he set A Year of Birds to music, and it was first performed in the August of 1995.
So is there a recording?
There is a recording. I would say at this point in time that I have never heard. It's that rare.
Yeah.
However, one of my colleagues and good friends, Gillian Dooley, who wrote a book entitled Listening to Iris Murdoch, Music, Sounds and Silences, which I have on the desk here, has heard it. So she got she was able to listen to it because she got in touch with Williamson's biographer. And it runs for a little over 30 minutes, she says, is densely scored with many birdsong references throughout, set against a rich array of orchestral sounds. So there we are.
I wanted to ask you about Gillian, because I was listening to one of your podcasts earlier, and it was the two with Gillian on music, and she made a very interesting reference to birdsong. She said it was going to feature in her book, and then because she said she's an Australian, so she was thinking, well, I'm surrounded by kookaburras, and so I don't want to write about English birdsong or something. Yeah. So she didn't. But one thing that she said that I thought was really interesting was that that chimes with what you've already said about how Murdoch thought about poetry, was that she didn't really have much of an intellectual grasp on music, which is somewhat belied with how music features in the novels.
And she couldn't read music.
Yeah. Does that extend to the music of poetry in your did she feel like this was something I do that I'm moved by, but I don't have the intellectual grasp on that I have elsewhere?
Possibly. I mean, poetry was the first thing that she ever wrote, we think. So she writes her first poem that we have that's extant and has been published, called The Fate of the Daisy Lee, when she's 14. And then when she gets to Badminton School, she starts writing poetry. 4 of those poems were then later published in a little booklet that she edited and published herself, called Poet Venturers, which was ostensibly written to provide cash to alleviate the distress which Japanese aggression has caused in China. And so this is in the late 1930s. And Badminton School, just outside of Bristol, probably quite well known in the UK, quite an important public school. And at that time, I think one of Gallance's children was actually a pupil with Iris Murdoch. And I think that might have helped a little bit as well to get it published. There are still copies available out there. You can find them online. They're about £100. There aren't that many of them. But one of the great things about that little collection, which has 4 of her poems, all of them with Iris Murdoch aged 18 after that, was that when W.H. Auden visited the school, she managed to sit next to him. She connived to sit next to him at lunch, and she told him that she was having this publication forthcoming, and wouldn't he like to write the forward to it. And W.H. Auden writes this. He says, "I was most interested to hear of this effort on the part of the schoolboys and girls in Bristol to use their own original work in order to raise money to alleviate this distress. Democracy cannot be genuine unless each of us in his or her sphere is prepared to serve it with heart and head. At the same time, democracy cannot demand such service. It has to be given of our own free will. But unless we do so, give it democracy is a sham, and soon supplanted by forms of government which demand social responsibility at the expense of freedom. A book of this kind, this little chapbook, is a hopeful sign that the youth of this country is beginning to realise that it must earn the right to be free. I therefore recommend it to the public for the sake of the poems themselves and for the practical expression of sympathy for their fellow human beings shown by these young people in Bristol. I hope the booklet will interest many, and that as a result of the sales, a considerable sum will be sent to the Fund for Chinese Medical Aid." W.H. Auden, Saturday, October the 29th, 1938. Clearly, that's something that hasn't exactly been dashed off, but it's obviously been written fairly quickly. But for him, at this point, at the height of his powers, W.H. Auden, at this point in time, to have read these poems and to have agreed, obviously a very busy man at this point in time, but also resonances, I think, with what's just about to happen in Europe as well. It's like this question about freedom, responsibility, and service, and so. I think that's a lovely kind of connection between Auden and Murdoch. And Murdoch was heavily influenced by Auden, by Hardy, and also by later on by T.S. Eliot. Of course, T.S. Eliot actually turns down her first novel Under the Net for publication, and she then goes elsewhere. But she does then write a very interesting essay called T.S. Eliot as a Moralist, which is available in her edited collection Existentialists and Mystics, which came out in 1997. So I think with Murdoch's poetry, I think she can always feel the hand of influence on her shoulder, or maybe on both shoulders. And I think, unlike great poets, she doesn't manage to escape that. But then, if you think about her kind of very near contemporary, Philip Larkin, he too felt the hand of Auden and Hardy and Betjeman and others besides. But he manages, of course, in his works to get out from underneath their influence, but Murdoch doesn't. I think this is why Murdoch never really goes in for publishing many of her poems.
No, so it must be a very strange feeling for you to have those 1,000 that you mentioned earlier, and that be such a radical expansion of the canon. Is there an arc? You said she might not quite escape the weight of her influences, but do you see a progression that you can track in them?
I do. I think you can see it in the way that her poetry expands, the way that she changes the way in which she develops stanzas as well, the way that she kind of leaves. Quite often she leaves rhyme schemes behind. She moves more towards blank verse a little bit as well. Again, it's not always the case, because it does vary in the poetry. So over the last couple of years, really, and I must give credit to the team. I'm only sort of tangentially involved, really. I have been involved somewhat, but the team of Frances White, Anne Rowe, and Rachel Herschler, particularly Rachel, who's done so much and because what they have done really is not just looked through these poems and decided along with me what should be included and what shouldn't be included, but Rachel's also digitized them all, and quite often with Murdoch, when you go through her journals, her poetry journals, you find that there are 8 or 9 different versions of the same poem, and it isn't that she goes back and she kind of annotates them or changes them. In a different notebook, she'll write the same poem out, and she doesn't always date them, so it's very difficult to kind of think about the chronology and what would be the final version. There's only one sequence called Conversations with a Prince, which she actually had typed up, I think probably in the 80s, that was almost ready for publication. So we can kind of assume that that's the final state. But for most of the other hundreds of poems, they are now thankfully digitized, but going through them and first working out finalized versions, and then deciding the kind of the merit of of publishing them or not has been an absolutely mammoth task.
Right.
But yeah, the team that have been working on that, and also Paul Huller in Japan and Pamela Osborne in London, have also been very useful as well in giving their expertise and knowledge of Murdoch's poetry. So it's been very much a group effort, and I've been quite a minor character in doing that. But yeah, it's great to have the chance to look at them. And yeah, I mean, Murdoch's very much like a puzzle, and when you have all these unpublished materials available, and not just these, all the letters and the annotations in all of our London Oxford libraries, you can start to put together a much fuller picture of the person and the author in development than just having a look at the novels or just the philosophy. So it's been a real real eye-opener, and wonderful that we've managed to acquire them for the archive and that they've been donated.
In her essay, The Sublime and the Good, Murdoch writes that Kant's view was that nature and art please us by resembling each other. That is, we like nature when it seems to be pointless. As examples of free beauty, i.e. true beauty, Kant gives flowers, birds, wallpaper patterns, lines aimlessly intertwining, and all music that is not set to words. He also says that a bird's song, which we can reduce to no musical role, seems to have more freedom in it, and thus to be richer for taste than the human voice, singing in accordance with all the rules that the art of music prescribes. Musicians who aim to reproduce the song of birds are squaring up to the world's real virtuosos. Mozart is said to have written his Piano Concerto No. 17, having been inspired by the song of his pet starling. But there are those who say the arrow of influence flew in the other direction, that it was the starling who heard Mozart's concerto and incorporated it into its own song. Poets who write about birds face the same challenge as musicians, and it is not surprising that so much bird poetry fixates on the direction of mimicry. In one of the poems I've already looked at, May, featuring the cuckoo, Murdoch includes a nest of imitations in just 4 lines. Now in the park, white cricketers and cuckoo calls, how like confetti the wild cherry falls, cool buds of May still keep the rose concealed, hollow as a flute that cry across the field. So you have confetti mimicking the way a wild cherry's bloom falls, and then the cry that is ambiguous. It could be the cry of the cricketers or the cry of the cuckoo, hollow as a flute and echoing across the field. Across the poems, we see repetitions or replications not just of the bird's song, but of their image too, as if Murdoch is thinking of the illustrated bird as much as the original. Of the blackbird, for instance, she says, "How mechanical you look." And in April, she writes of a moorhen, "Over the pearly grass your early shadow follows," the internal rhyme enacting that following shadow. Perhaps Murdoch had Stone's illustrations in front of her or in mind, thinking of those prints pressed to the woodcut, the original of a bird creating its shadow. The gulls in January are explicitly compared to illustrations. Winter white, they pass me by, as pale as paper in the sky. As are the magpies in June, black and white magpie from a Chinese picture, that fly slowly as a helicopter on our midsummer freeze. And October gives us the image of a swan reflected in the stream where the bird's sudden movement has made no sound. Murdoch's October poem is reminiscent of some of Sylvia Plath's swan material. A single swan floats chaste as snow, taunting the clouded mind, which hungers to haul the white reflection down.
And of course, Plath was a Murdoch reader. She was quite keen on the novel. So,
yes, yeah.
nice. Whereas Philip Larkin was also a Murdoch reader, but was not a fan of the novels.
Not very keen, yeah.
No.
Well, speaking of people not keen on Murdoch, the poems that apart from A Year of Birds, the only poems that I've read are in an article, feature in an article you wrote in the Brophy book.
Oh right, yeah.
The reference to the private poems, and I think there's a fairly long one from Iris that's in there. And
yes, there is. Yeah, quite a jokey but very clever. Poem. Yeah.
Are the poems that are going to feature in this collection of that kind of correspondence, or are these more poems that were meant as public?
These are poems that were meant to be as poems, and although there are some that are dedicated to former friends and lovers, particularly the academic Wallace Robson, there's I think we're going to hopefully publish some of those. In fact, most of the poems to Wallace Robson have already been published in a back issue of the Iris Murdoch Review.
Oh, right.
So that is open access on the Iris Murdoch Society webpage, so people can have a look at that if they want to. So those came out about 10, 12 years ago. But I think to have them in, they in a sense, when you publish a collection of poetry, poems are always in conversation with each other. So we've tried to include what we think are good poems, but also poems that showcase a span from across her life, and also poems that kind of deal with different themes and different issues. So quite often there are themes that crop up time and time again, particularly in regards to ecology and animal life and birds in particular. But also the poems that deal with London, poems that deal with unrequited love. So it's trying to find a balance. And also always with the thought in mind that actually, what would Murdoch think about these poems being published as well? Are there any that should be left out because they are overly personal? So there's that kind of artistic judgment, also that kind of biographical judgment that you've got to make when you're bringing out something like this. So we'll see. It's not been we've not I think it's pretty much nailed down, but I think we've got one more meeting to discuss the next steps. I mean, we know what we want to do, but yeah, just getting the timeline sorted, really.
Does the 1997 process shed any light on what Murdoch would like for her poems? Because that you mentioned early on there were these two editors, but it was late on in Murdoch's ill and.
Yes, so this is Poems by Iris Murdoch, which came out with a university press in Japan, edited by Jose Maroy, who's no longer with us, and Paul Huller, who is very active and is the president of the Iris Murdoch Society of Japan. So yes, for the people who are interested, I did a podcast with Paul about a year ago, and he actually talks about that in some detail on that episode, his relationship with Iris and the development of the poems. What he found was that Iris would often send them poems to look at and say, well, actually, maybe these are for publication, and then she would withdraw them later on. So the process of actually publishing them was a little bit drawn out. Obviously, they republish the material that's in Poet Venturers, which came out in 1938. They republish A Year of Birds. They republish poems that had already been out in the public domain in some form. But there are also a few poems that she was happy to be published, but others that she wasn't. And we've it's been really useful to be able to talk to Paul about that and decide, and both decide whether we should include them and which ones they were that she said that Murdoch originally said no to in the 90s. Obviously, the 1990s are some years ago now, but Paul can still can remember those conversations. So he's been really useful in thinking about that. And he said it was an interesting task to bring the poems out and he at the same time they did a collection of Murdoch's occasional essays as well. But it's going to be good, I think, to have the poems much more accessible than they are at the moment, because either you need to go and read them in the archive or pay an incredible amount of money for out of print editions. So.
So it represents a huge expansion of the catalogue for public audience.
It will, and it will be selected. So we're thinking probably 120, 150 poems out of 1,000. And depending how that process goes, at some point there might be the collected edition and bring everything and just publish everything. But I think that's some way down the line.
Well, I'm sure you'll have some people pushing for it for sure.
Quite possibly. It'd be interesting to see what the reaction is when they are finally published.
Last time Miles was on the podcast, we talked about Murdoch's novel The Green Knight, inspired by the medieval poem about Sir Gawain. In the final poem of A Year of Birds, December, there are resonances of that tale. In the dripping blood, the theme of Christian deliverance, and the tangled wood of Old Man's beard. It was a favourite season of Murdoch's. As she wrote in a letter to Bridget Brophy, doesn't Christmas symbolise something wonderful? So it seems appropriate to leave you with the final poem in the collection, December. When the dark hawberries hang down and drip like blood, and the old man's beard has climbed up high in the wood, and the golden bracken has come again to heal and pardon, Then the little robin follows me through the garden. In the dark days his breast is like a rose. Roses are another echo throughout this collection. We have the pale primroses of March, the rosy and yellow light of the April willow, the cool buds of May that keep the rose concealed, the flowering roses of June with their long, transparent stems, and the rose hips reflected along with the swan in October. Now in December, the little robin's breast likened to a rose. In the landscape of this collection, the rose is a constant presence, not always as a flower, sometimes as a flush of colour, or just the word itself. A symbol of continuity throughout the changing birds and seasons.
One thing that we could end on, I think, is a lovely piece that Murdoch wrote towards the end of her life about poetry. So in her final novel, this is Jackson's Dilemma, which came out in 1995. She has one of her characters say this. This is Bennett, one of the central characters of Jackson's Dilemma. He says, "I am small and I do not understand. How I wish I had stayed in the light and devoted my life to poetry, not philosophy. I used to write poems when I was young, before I became bemused by that philosophy, and now it is all impossible." And I wonder whether that's Murdoch speaking a little bit through Bennett at that particular point in time. Her final novel is much shorter than her late novels, the other late novels. It's a little bit more confused in terms of narrative development, but there's an awful lot of Murdoch in there. We've got Bennett also dealing with an unpublished work on Heidegger, much as Murdoch was, and talking about poetry and kind of showing, I guess, her fears and her and her knowledge really of her decline in that novel, which makes it quite heartbreaking. But there's certainly, I think, this idea that although Murdoch wanted to be a novelist as well as a philosopher, and very much interested in art and music, that I think poetry really is a central facet of her personality. And clearly, if she's been writing it from as a young teenager right the way through to when she becomes very ill, then I think it's an art form worth paying attention to. Will she ever be acclaimed as a great poet? No, I don't think so. But I think it'll be an interesting kind of new angle in which to perceive Murdoch as one of the most important writers of the late 20th century.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Many thanks to my guest, Miles Leeson. I'll leave a link in the episode description box below where you can pre-order a copy of the upcoming selected poems of Iris Murdoch. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please check out our previous episode we did together on the Green Knight, and also check out Miles's own podcast, the Iris Murdoch Society podcast, which has some fantastic guests and episodes on all things Iris Murdoch. That's all from me today. Until next time, happy reading.